Thanks for joining me again. Fantastic to have you have another conversation with us. Over the last few weeks, what we've talked about is a couple of things. So first of all, we talked about that your team is lying to you about culture, capacity, and some of the challenges that a lot of organizations face when embarking on M&A programs. Then we talked about, well, it's all broken, now what? So a lot of systems thinking, how do you manage risk? What do you need to do? And I guess what the conversation we wanted to have today is all about leadership. How do you step up and be a leader? And some of the themes there around mergers and acquisitions, pre and post integration, and what kind of things you want to do there. So welcome back. Thanks for joining me.
Well, thank you for having me again. This has been a fantastic series, something I'm passionate about. I know something you're passionate about as well. And we just see so many of these programs that they're well-run programs, but they're not getting the outcomes that they were anticipating. And as you said, right, the constraints and challenges they have in terms of communication styles and culture and capacity. And again, the risk management aspect of it, all set a pretty dire outlook and really justify why some of those facts and figures you brought forth on the Harvard study of so many deals fail, right? So what's the glue that makes it happen? And I think it's giving people tools that allow them to lead in those environments versus just manage in those environments. So super excited to talk to you today about what it means to lead and what kinds of tools we could help folks think about in the context of making the role of the leader much more accessible.
Yeah, and let's start there, right? I mean, from my point of view, who is the leader, right? I mean, I think that's a critical question here. We've mentioned systems thinking before and maybe subsystems, so we're going to link that into some of this conversation. So I think quite often leadership is maybe misconstrued, right? Leadership is, hey, it's the guys at the very top who are either leading this deal or maybe working directly with that person. But actually, there's so many other functions that are involved. You've got your HR people, you've got your IT people, and others who all have to step up and also lead. And maybe they've actually never done this before. So let's start there in terms of how do these systems actually play in? What do you see as the systems and how that works? I mean,
It's a great question. And, what's interesting when you raise that leadership piece, who is in charge? Who's the leader? And it always does fall back on the sponsor's the leader. And to your point, a lot of times the deal is either insignificant in the realm of the sponsor's total mandate, or significantly, the sponsor doesn't know this is their first time leading one of those deals. So how do you help them when you're a leader in this post-merger integration environment or this post-merger environment? How do you help them as a leader when you're not the name on the org chart, right? You don't control anything, but you're responsible for influencing everything. And the systems approach that we use allows for that environment where you can create influence. One element is just the ability to ask better questions. So starting to build rapport, starting to build trust, starting to ask good questions of our sponsors. So you're not confronting them and challenging their on paper authority. You're actually acting as a support advisor for them. And the second is just starting to think about developing asymmetric information. So what is that asymmetric information? How do I put the deal aspirations together with what the merger integration teams are bringing together? And we've used a three-lens approach to do that, right? We start thinking about one system, 7 subsystems. So the acquisition was about turning cash into cash flow. You paid a set amount of value for that. You put a set amount of cash at work. But there's a bunch of these subsystems, and with this 3 capital lens, the financial capital you've put to work, the human capital you've put to work, and the intellectual capital you've put to work are ways that we start to play that out. We'll talk through some examples, but that lens gets very simply to what's the overall cost, who's doing the work, and what work are they doing? What are you seeing in that regard from an initial leadership piece around a systems approach?
Well, I think those lenses are actually spot on, and I think they need to be built into the way that actually everything is looked at. So we've talked about risk before, actually. Well, what are those risks with those lenses being applied, and actually how are they truly being managed I think more often than not, these programs are actually just treated as programs to get stuff done, and those lenses are forgotten, if I'm perfectly honest. So I think it comes down to just bringing them to the forefront and making sure that everything is understood. What is the true human impact here? Do we have retention risks here? What are we actually intending to do? Are we intending to merge teams? How is it going to work in the future? It's applying all of that thinking every time to every aspect, and that actually helps things move forward. And if you forget one, then you'll just take the pain later. So it's either take the pain up front and hopefully make it a smoother run, or have a program after the program, if you will, to fix some of those challenges.
No, and some of it, as we mentioned in the other sessions, it's not the team's fault, right? It's the environment. It's the game that they've been playing. It's the places where they chip their teeth, they blacken their eyes, they've gotten their knees skinned, and in those places it was very much program management oriented, right? So you've sat in hundreds, if not thousands, of post-merger integration update or status meetings. I've sat the same. If I wish I tallied them. I'd really wish, because then you go, well, this is my 1,000th meeting that I've sat in. So you can start to quantify, well, how many of these meetings were very traditionally focused? They had an emphasis on progress. They were talking about milestones and tasks, and there was very little conversation about the value target of the team. So one of the things when I first start working with teams, I'll sit and just observe those meetings and get a sense of how can we now apply this lens. The easiest lens, and I'll start there, is the financial lens, right? And often that's just the budget. But I think about let's take a function on IT, right? I think there's an objective function for IT that says I'm trying to manage the total cost to serve. I may have a plan number in that may be based on a certain set of functions, right? And we think about that in the objective function that we would set up would be total cost to serve is a function of the original budget, the number of technical people, the population served. A thing that I would apply is events, right? Because you could then split that out as different kinds of events, whether they're transactions that are being supported in maybe a commercial sales system or a financial processing system, or they're just the incidents, right? Either the small kind of individual generated incidents or the big security incidents that happen. So I have available those numbers, and then I think about the total cost to serve. When I'm looking at it through that lens, I have a natural way now of adding that dimension in and thinking about leading that dimension. So if the number of the population I'm using changes because I'm trying to scale this business, I'm not just trying to reduce costs or consolidate systems. I'm trying to think about how do I manage total cost to serve in that regard, and that orchestrates around. So that's where we start applying the financial lens and bringing that in as a driver to help inform decisions in the decision meetings, no longer the update meetings that we would encourage. So what kinds of things are you seeing in the financial lens that help someone be more of a leader, an influential leader in the integration space?
Well, I think for me it comes down to two things really. The basics, right, from the start. What are those critical KPIs that we actually want to be tracking? And secondly, to your point about updates versus decisions, how are we reporting on them? I think from our world where we manage a lot of these transformations, the design of the reporting that goes out tends to be more of an update, as opposed to really tracking those KPIs and say, well, what are you guys doing? What is the objective here? Where are you trying to get to? So I do think that more often than not, actually, some of those budget numbers aren't visible because, as I said before, people are just executing stuff to try and either consolidate systems in your case in the IT space, or merge teams and looking at the org structure. But perhaps there's a gap in terms of really thinking about, well, what's it going to mean to the bottom line? Yeah. What's it actually going to mean to the cost to serve? And ultimately, I think the other piece is what's it going to mean for the operations of the business? Because I think sometimes we also forget that the customer is king, and all of these functions have to work wing to wing, and you can't just cut one without impacting another. So I think those are some of the considerations out there.
No, absolutely. Absolutely. I love how you thought about setting those KPIs up front. In my experience, those numbers that we would get, I would often get pushback from teams by saying, oh, we don't have time in the pre-deal to get into that detail, nor do we have time in the integration to get to that kind of detail. And a lot of what I've discovered in some of my experiences is it doesn't add any time. It's just the reorganization of information you already have. We often have those numbers by function at a top-down level. And I could do a rough order of magnitude model on those to understand where's the work, where are the risks and issues going to be. But that financial piece sets a first and foremost framework. The KPIs have to also come out of the human and the intellectual capital aspects. So as we think about the human piece, this is where the conversation of risks and issues always manifests itself, because it's either an issue that I don't have the people that we need to do the work, or it's a risk that the people that can do the work and deliver that tradecraft of that business that you bought, you paid a premium for, that they're going to leave. So when you start thinking about the human capital aspect of it, really getting a conversation to articulate the retention, the succession planning, the thinking about talent development, and then ultimately the scaling or growing of talent in that business, right? You buy a business, you don't expect it to run the same way it does. It's going to have some aspiration of growth. Right? You wouldn't have bought it. You don't buy businesses to shrink them. So if you're going to grow, you're going to probably need to add people. How do you do it effectively? And that whole human capital lens starts to open up, the lens where we often have people doing culture work that view that as soft work. Culture is the load-bearing member of the business that you bought. And when the culture breaks, the businesses collapse. So that human capital lens becomes really, really important and a great place for a leader to start to articulate vision, to start to manage progress, to start to communicate guidance, and even get crosstalk around what are we doing to mitigate the risk that's tied to this financial lens that we have. What are you seeing on the HR side or the human capital side?
I think the human capital side, culture is key, right? So what I've seen on a number of these integrations is culture is often an afterthought, or it is, like you said, just a soft consideration. Whereas in reality, sometimes you get a lot of fatigue in the teams, especially if there's a merger. People get scared and they get worried about what is my job in the future. Maybe it's not actually clear how things are going to hang together, and you do end up with that cultural aspect the human capital aspect causing some undue grief, and actually people get distracted. The other thing I've seen on a number of these programs is that people are not backfilled early enough. So they're expected to do everything. They're expected to run all the pre-deal stuff. They're expected to execute the post-merger integration and do their job and manage their self as part of all of these fears that come from an M&A program. And it's treated as an afterthought, and it's treated as you're just going to have to suck it up and it'll be fine later. But people are people, and I think that's where the leadership really comes in. That's where the senior executives need to really speak out and communicate clearly where we're going and what is happening. It also means that the external folks who are brought in also communicate clearly as to what is their job and why are they there and what are they aiming to do. And because ultimately they're there to help make these deals successful, not disrupt the operations of the business. And then it comes down to that, I guess, each function very clearly articulating to their teams, this is where we're going. I mean, these are massive initiatives, and they can have such fundamental impacts if the human side is not thought through. And it is the biggest thing, right? Without humans, you don't have any of the financial gains. You don't have any process. You don't have any business. So I think it's a fundamental lens that must be applied.
No, and I see it like you said, it's always an afterthought. And a lot of times the succession plan as well, when a senior leader leaves, will just move the next person up. And it's sometimes in large acquisitions, right? I've seen this time and time again. The person that you hire into that role isn't running the order of magnitude size business that you've asked of them. And it's not like they have that kind of experience that they're able to pull their team towards that. They're now in a bit of a quagmire themselves, and they've never run that size business. And if we're not there as those integration leaders to give them the tools, right, on the human capital side, and really have those upfront conversations about succession planning, retention, and talent development, just in and of that, what are your current people doing? If we're not helping them with those conversations, we control none of it. We've got to be whispering in their ears. We've got to ask them better questions to get them to pause and think about, well, my gut says to do this. Why might that not be the right thing to do at that point? So that trusted advisor role in terms of the piece we play. But then it comes down to the intellectual capital, right? This is what makes this business so special if it's not the people? It's process, platform, and the expression of culture, which is habits, right? So you start thinking about process, platform, and habits, and what do you need to do in that place? Well, first of all, we have to protect it. Right. So you think about, if we were talking about the IT function, how do we prevent this from leaking out and getting, security incidents and those kinds of things? And those lend themselves very well to a PMO-like approach. Well, everyone's on the same thing. We've issued new laptops. We've put in commercial grade, Wi-Fi router points. We've got technology and compliance audits in place, right? So there's a lot of strong emphasis on that. But then you forget, this company has tradecraft that made it successful and attractive to us. How do we preserve that? And how do we preserve those habits? And by putting these three lenses together, you get a much more comprehensive view than just a program management update. We're back to thinking about the whole business. We're back to thinking about business-driven integration rather than functional optimization of integration. We're back to using data and analytics, and we're doing things in a way that is decision-oriented, not update-oriented. So I think that's how it all wraps this together and puts together a nice platform for someone to be a leader in that process and fill that gap that we've identified.
100%, and I think actually let's pick up on the PMO piece that you just mentioned there, right? Because I think the program itself, or the initiative to actually complete the merger and get the value, does require a lot of leadership and some coordination, and actually putting those lenses does really help. But I guess a traditional PMO is an update function, right? I mean, it depends how it's been set up, but it actually exists there.
And it's not going to go away. It's not going away.
Oh, and it's absolutely fundamental. I don't think you can run these major programs without some kind of formalized structure and mechanism and ways to escalate things and ways to actually communicate and analyze, right? And that is absolutely what the PMO must do, or the integration management office. You can use different names for these things, and they work in much the same way as the others. But then actually linking it back to this leadership context, right? Where does the leading come from? Because PMOs typically don't actually provide that leadership. They're there to help facilitate some of the activities that happen. But we had this concept, you and I were talking about this. Well, shouldn't there be a post-merger integration leadership office that actually sets the direction, applies those lenses, forces those sub-teams to really think about the cross-functional impacts and really allows everyone to connect back to that original value premise, right? Why are we doing this? And I think from the leadership point of view as well, those leaders, from my perspective, need to be the same guys that actually were there at the beginning saying, hey, here's what we're trying to do, and here's what we're trying to achieve, and here's why. I think quite often, actually, the why are we doing this is forgotten as people try and go at pace and execute the more traditional PMO activities as opposed to the value drivers. So that's kind of my thought on that is there's a gap, there's a leadership gap often that needs to be filled, and the right structures in these programs need to be put in place.
Yeah, you raise an excellent point, and I see it all the time as you start to do transition into business as usual, right? You're trying to absorb this thing, you're trying to put a stake in the ground that goes, integration is over, right? The program management happens, it's done. Two big themes that come out of that. The first is, what is done? And I've often seen each of the functional areas have a different done time. Which again, you're sitting here going, wait a minute, if the integration's not done, how do these functionals exit? And it becomes a thing where you are orchestrating all of these. They're not independent actions, right? The tuba player can't stop playing separately than when the violinist is playing and the flautist is playing or the trumpeter is playing, right? So, because the orchestra won't play out. So that orchestra conductor role is a good analogy for how do I orchestrate all the great things. I'm never going to have the experience of an HR specialist that's in a functional integration role. I will never. They're going to have so much of a lens to bring forward, but I will bring, just as you and your teams will bring, a layer that allows the best of that to be orchestrated, and you get to a real done. The second big theme that I see that just always allows this to continue on, particularly as I would put integration teams into places, is it would tend to exit at the bottom. And you can't have it exit at the bottom. You have to have it exit at the top. What do I mean by that? You're starting to winnow down the team, you're starting to reduce support, and you're keeping the lowest level resources in doing the day-to-day work. And that day-to-day work never gets taken on by the business as usual team. So you end up keeping that person in that role much longer. Exiting out the top, you're staying in and you're staying connected to the sponsor or the leader of that integrated group, and you're continuing to provide them advice and guidance as they're backfilling what used to be that integration team. So those are two big limitations that end up harming an integration approach and leading to some of the confusion of how do you now declare success and start harvesting the fruits of the acquisition.
But I do think in some of that, right, it's realistic to expect this concept of a program after the program. So yes, there is a major initiative that tries to be done, and definition of done is absolutely critical, right? There's certain contracts and penalties that you might hit, and then there's more the operational aspects as to, well, how does this business function, right? But sometimes what I've seen is you actually have to accept some pain. You have to take it, and you have to just resource up for it, so that when the program does start to exit and you do have those last, let's call them grabs of the program still running, you're gearing up again to actually fix the things that you could never have seen, right? Because you don't know until you know, right? Once you're integrated, you're going to start to learn. And then in order to take advantage of the opportunities or mitigate the risks that arise from that, you need to actually set up something that will catch it and move forward. And I don't think that should ever be underestimated. And I think a lot of people do, because they don't necessarily have the data up front. They don't have the teams up front. Yeah. They don't necessarily understand what these programs are going to do and the direction they may take. So I think my key theme in a lot of that is actually just accept it from the get-go that there will be some pain, and especially as a leader, communicate that there'll be pain, and we'll get through it together, and it will be okay, and we will be successful. And then done can get to done with the acceptance that phase 2 kicks in to make it even better. And I think that's really, really important for folks out there to think about.
Yeah, and that's fantastic. And from my deal execution experience, you're still performance tracking well after integrations are done, right? So you do have that ability to look into the business and provide guidance at a leadership level, because you are doing performance tracking. But you're right, that evolution from what's appropriately phased day 0, day 100, end of integration needs to be orchestrated, understanding that those were all hunches when you made that original plan. The market gets to vote in that, your customers, the people in the organization, and all of those things are dynamic. So the program within a program aspect, or the program after the program, are really solid indications that that's going to happen every time, because your hunches aren't going to be 100% right. So that leadership role, again, or that leadership layer that we're proposing, I think does allow for the malleability of a plan. It does allow for the dynamic changes in a plan, and it does allow for the setting up of what are the components of that program within a program after the program.
Absolutely. And then the next one will come in and actually need to be integrated or divested, and off we go again, right? I mean, it's just how these things work in reality, right? So I think there's a lot to consider there. So what thoughts should we leave people with?
No, fantastic. I think this whole series has been about improving the overall performance of acquisitions, right? Setting the value more appropriately, and then everything we've been talking about are the obstacles to getting the value out of the deal. So I think that the systems view, the role of an integration office as a leader not just a program manager, bringing in place the principles we talked about earlier, right? A whole business view, a business-driven integration approach, the use of data and analytics, a much more explicit use of RAID logs to really think about risks and issues that are present in the deal, and then ultimately that it's strategy first, people always, and operator minded that makes it successful.
100%. And I would just add to that many folks have actually never done this before. So if you need help, talk to people that have, and actually we can be successful, because that's what this is all about.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, I think we're gearing up for a Q&A session coming out of this. I think these are three phenomenal topics, and again, provocative, right? Why is your team lying to you? Even though they're not lying to you, they're just constrained. Why it's broken, and how do you fix it? How do you fix it? So this has been fantastic, Pekka. Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much for joining me.
Great conversation. Looking forward to the Q&A.